The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the dense forest. A thick fog began to curl up from the earth, wrapping itself around the ancient trees like a heavy cloak. In the stillness of the evening, the air was thick with the scent of damp moss and decaying leaves. Far from the noise of civilization, a solitary wildlife sanctuary lay nestled between the jagged hills. It was a place untouched by human hands, a realm where animals roamed freely, and the forest had long claimed dominance. For weeks now, the caretakers had been watching from the edges, monitoring the movements of the sanctuary's animals. They had been preparing for the arrival of the sparrows. Their migration route was unpredictable, but they always found their way to the sanctuary at the start of spring. A cluster of dense, untamed trees had grown around a forgotten clearing, where the sparrows had made their nests for generations. This place, this nest, was known to be fragile. Only a few weeks every year would the sparrows return to this small patch of land, and only if they felt the balance of the forest was right. But this year, something was different. The caretakers, two figures who had dedicated their lives to preserving this sanctuary, had noticed that the usual signs of migration had shifted. They knew that the sparrows weren't just birds. They were the pulse of the forest. Their return meant that the ecosystem was flourishing, that the sanctuary was healthy and alive. If they failed to arrive, it would mean something was terribly wrong. The sky darkened with the first hint of a storm, as the caretakers, cloaked in heavy rain jackets, trudged through the thick undergrowth. Their boots sank into the wet earth, and the sound of their movement barely disturbed the wildlife that hid behind the trees. The sanctuary's inhabitants, deer, rabbits, foxes, and other creatures watched from a distance, feeling the tension in the air. They knew something was coming. The usual tranquility was disrupted. The caretakers moved deeper into the heart of the sanctuary, where the sparrow's nest had been year after year. Their eyes flickered between the trees. Every so often, a rustling would break the silence, squirrel darting from one branch to another, the flapping of wings in the distance, but no sparrows. Not yet. The storm began to pick up, and the first drops of rain fell like sharp needles from the heavy sky. Yet the caretakers pressed on, their hands brushing the wet leaves. They had to find the nest, had to see if the sparrows had come. As they reached the clearing, their hearts sank. The familiar cluster of trees was there, but the air was thick with an unfamiliar presence. It felt wrong. The usual sounds of the forest were muted, as though even the wind had learned to hold its breath. No birds perched on the branches. No animals scurried across the ground. The entire clearing was still, the silence suffocating. Then, through the dense fog, they saw it. A nest perched high in the crook of an old oak tree, its branches twisted with age. It was not the familiar sight they had expected. The sparrow's nest was empty, completely deserted. But there was something more. Lying at the base of the tree was a single, broken egg. The shell was cracked, its contents spilled into the wet earth, seeping slowly into the soil. Something had happened here. Something that had caused the sparrows to abandon the nest before they even arrived. The caretakers exchanged a glance, their breath shallow. They knew what it meant. This wasn't just an absence of birds. It was a warning. They began to search the area with greater urgency, the storm now pouring down relentlessly. Their footsteps were loud against the soaked ground as they pushed through the underbrush. Every now and then, a quick rustling sound, a shadow darting between the trees made them pause. It was as if the forest itself was watching them, waiting for them to realize what they had missed. Then, they found it. At the far end of the clearing, under a thicket of brambles, a new nest had been built. This one was unlike anything they had ever seen. It was too large, crafted not by birds, but by something else. Twigs, leaves, and branches were intricately woven into a shape that was almost too perfect. Something had been carefully constructing this unnatural nest. The caretakers felt their skin prickle with dread as they crouched beside it, their fingers brushing the smooth, worn bark. It was too deliberate, too purposeful. Sudden, the ground trembled beneath their feet. A low growl echoed through the forest, faint at first, but unmistakable. The caretakers froze. The sound grew louder, closer, and a chill crept into the air. Something was moving in the fog, something big, something dangerous. The animals in the sanctuary were gone, now hidden, silent, sensing the predator that lurked in the shadows. A silhouette emerged from the mist, moving with an eerie, deliberate pace. The caretaker's heart raced. It was no animal they had seen before, no creature they had ever studied. A tall, gaunt figure draped in darkness, its features obscured by the cloak of fog and night. It stepped into the clearing, and for a moment, everything went still. Then, without warning, the figure lunged. The caretakers barely had time to react as the figure's long, spindly arms swept through the air, knocking them off their feet. The world spun as they tumbled to the ground, their breath stolen in an instant. The creature, too quick and too strong, dragged them toward the nest, its movements precise as if it had done this countless times before. But as they fought to break free, the nest was not meant for sparrows. It was a trap. The sanctuary, this place that had once thrived with life, was not its own anymore. Something had taken over. Something darker than they could have ever imagined had claimed the forest as its own. With one final, desperate push, they broke free, scrambling back toward the safety of the forest. But as they ran, they heard the low growl again, and then, in the distance, the unmistakable sound of wings. It was not the sparrows. It was something far more sinister, something that had been waiting in the shadows for years, watching, building its nest for its own dark purposes. And now, the caretakers knew. The sanctuary had been lost. The creatures that once called it home were gone, and the true predator had claimed its territory. The forest was no longer a sanctuary. It was a hunter's den. The caretakers stumbled through the thickening fog, hearts pounding in their chests as the shadows seemed to grow longer, darker, and more oppressive. They could barely see a few feet in front of them, the dimming light and pouring rain blurring their vision. But they knew they had to keep moving. They had to find shelter somewhere safe to gather their thoughts, to make sense of what had just happened. Behind them, the distant sound of the unnatural wings flapping seemed to follow, though the figure that had attacked them remained unseen. It was as if the entire forest had been corrupted, turned against them, its very heartbeat now altered. The familiar hum of life, the chirping of birds, the rustling of small mammals in the underbrush had vanished, replaced with an eerie quiet that clung to the air like smoke. The creatures that once called the sanctuary home were either gone or hiding, their instincts guiding them far from the clearing. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The caretakers reached the edge of the forest, their eyes scanning for any sign of safety, a cabin, a patrol post, anything to provide them with some sense of protection. But the landscape stretched out before them empty, silent, and far from the familiar paths they had walked so many times before. The fog clung to the earth, creeping through the trees, whispering like something alive, something ancient. One of the caretakers stopped, his hand pressing against a gnarled oak tree to steady himself. His mind raced. He had been in this forest for years, but never like this. Something had changed. The forest had shifted, and it was no longer the peaceful refuge they had known. The predator wasn't just a physical threat. It was an insidious force, woven into the very fabric of the sanctuary. This wasn't an attack on the sparrows alone, it was an attack on the sanctuary itself. Suddenly, a distant, high-pitched call broke the silence. The sound was strange and unsettling, a harsh screech that echoed through the fog, sending a shiver up their spines. The caretakers turned toward the sound. It wasn't a bird call, they both recognized it. It was a warning, a cry for help. It came from deep within the sanctuary, from the very heart of the forest, where the sparrows' nests had once stood. Without exchanging words, they both knew what they had to do. The forest had sent its signal. The creature, whatever it was, had drawn them out, luring them into the center of its dark domain. The caretakers had to face it, had to find what had taken hold of the land before it was too late. They turned back, pushing forward, into the darkened heart of the forest. The fog thickened with every step, and the trees seemed to close in around them. Every sound felt amplified, the splashing of their feet in the soggy undergrowth, the rustling of unseen creatures in the branches above. But there was something else now, something lurking just beyond their senses. The air felt heavier, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Then, just as they reached the clearing where the nest had once stood, they saw it. A flicker of movement in the mist. At first it was a shadow, just a blur in the distance, but as it grew closer, they could make out the form of a bird, its wings extended wide. But it wasn't a sparrow. It was much larger, its wings ragged and torn, its body twisted and unnatural. It hovered in the air, its eyes glowing a faint, eerie yellow, watching them as it floated toward the ground. Its movements were slow, deliberate, almost as though it were studying them, sizing them up. The caretakers froze, their breath shallow and quick. They were no longer alone in the sanctuary. The creature, whatever it was, had found them. With a shriek, the bird dove toward the ground, its claws scraping against the earth as it landed with a thud. It was massive now, far too large to be any natural bird. Its form resembling a grotesque hybrid of a sparrow and something darker. The nest it hadn't been built for the sparrows. It had been a trap for something far more sinister. Something that fed on the life force of the land itself, using the sparrows as a lure, a distraction. The caretakers could see it now in full, its twisted skeletal wings, its hollowed-out eyes, and its sharp beak that glinted in the faint light. Its body was covered in a patchwork of old feathers, matted and drenched with rain, and its talons dug into the soil, rooting it to the earth as though it was part of the forest itself. In the distance, another call echoed through the trees. But this time, it wasn't a cry for help. It was a command. The ground beneath their feet trembled once more as they watched in horror. The creature raised its head, the eerie call reverberating through the forest. Then, in a sudden flurry of movement, the fog seemed to swirl around them, and from within it, more forms began to appear, more of the twisted, monstrous birds, their eyes glowing like embers in the mist. The caretakers knew they were surrounded. There was no escape. The sanctuary was lost. The forest had become something else, something ancient, something hungry. The creatures had been waiting, watching for the right moment to rise from the shadows. And now that moment had come. The caretakers, once so confident in their knowledge of the land, now stood on the precipice of their greatest fear. The forest that had once been their home was no longer a sanctuary. It had become the hunting ground. With a final, deafening screech, the birds descended, the mist swallowing them whole as the caretakers ran. But there was nowhere to hide now. The creatures had claimed the forest, and the sparrows had never returned. The forest was theirs, and the caretakers, like the sparrows before them, were now part of its dark, eternal cycle. The air grew thick with the scent of damp earth and decay as the caretakers stumbled through the dense fog. Their legs burned from exhaustion, their breath ragged and panicked. They pushed forward, desperate for some form of safety, some sign that they weren't completely alone. But all around them, the mist seemed to close in tighter, and the silence was unbearable, pressing against their ears. The ground beneath them seemed to shift with every step, as if the very forest was alive, reacting to their every movement. Behind them, the creature's eerie screeches echoed, distant but unrelenting. The caretakers had no sense of time, no way of knowing whether it had been minutes or hours since the birds had attacked. Every turn, every rustle of leaves, set their nerves on edge, but they couldn't afford to stop. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, a labyrinth with no exit. They were trapped in the heart of it, and with each step, the oppressive feeling of being hunted grew stronger. Then, as they reached the foot of an ancient oak tree, one of them, Jack the younger of the two, dropped to his knees, gasping for air. His eyes were wide with fear, but something else lingered in them. A spark of realization, of understanding that chilled the very marrow of his bones. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rising wind, "the sparrows. They're not gone. They are here." Sarah turned toward him, her eyes searching his face in confusion. But Jack wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the base of the oak tree, his hand trembling as he pointed. Sarah followed his gaze, and her heart skipped a beat. The ground beneath the tree was shifting, as if something below was moving, pushing upward from the depths of the earth. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the soil parted, revealing something strange. At first it looked like a mass of roots, but as they drew closer, they saw that it was far more intricate. It wasn't just plant matter, it was a web of thin, silver threads, glistening with an unnatural sheen. And embedded within those threads were sparrow feathers, thousands of them. The feathers were stuck to the threads, as if they had been woven into the very fabric of the earth itself. Some were whole, others tattered and broken, but all were unmistakable. The sparrows had never left. They had been absorbed into the sanctuary, their very essence now part of the land, part of whatever force had claimed the forest. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and she took a step back, her heart racing. The realization hit her with the force of a thunderclap. The birds weren't just victims. They had become vessels. The forest had absorbed them, using their life force to grow stronger, to feed the unnatural creature they had encountered earlier. The sanctuary wasn't just a home for wildlife. It was a trap, a living entity that fed on the creatures within it. Sarah reached for Jack's arm, pulling him back as the ground continued to shift. The silver threads growing more pronounced, pulsing with a strange energy. The mist swirled tighter, thicker, and the air grew colder, carrying with it an oppressive sense of dread. "We have to leave now," Sarah said, her voice tight with panic. But Jack, his eyes still fixed on the unsettling scene before them, didn't move. "No," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "We can't leave. Not anymore. We're already part of it. Can't you feel it? We've been marked." Before Sarah could respond, a low rumble echoed through the forest, and the trees around them groaned, as if in response to Jack's words. The earth trembled beneath their feet, the web of threads beneath the oak tree writhing like a living thing. From the shadows, the birds appeared once again. But this time, they weren't alone. The creatures that had once hovered in the fog were now fully formed, standing tall on their twisted skeletal legs. Their wings, battered and torn, folded against their backs, their eyes glowing an eerie yellow as they turned toward the caretakers. They didn't move. They didn't need to. In the silence that followed, Sarah realized the creatures weren't attacking. They were waiting. Waiting for something. Waiting for them. The ground continued to tremble, and the air grew thick with the weight of something ancient and malignant. The sparrows, those tiny, delicate birds, had become part of this twisted, malevolent force, and now the caretakers, too, were caught in its grasp. The sanctuary had become a prison for all who entered, its boundaries marked not by fences or gates, but by an unbreakable connection to the land itself. Jack's face had drained of color, his eyes hollow with a growing understanding of what the sanctuary had become. He turned to Sarah, and for the first time, she saw fear in his eyes. They were no longer the caretakers of the sanctuary. Without warning, the silver threads surged upward from the earth, wrapping around the base of the oak tree, twisting through the branches, and reaching toward the sky. The creatures let out a low, guttural sound, almost like a chant. Their eyes locked on the caretakers as the threads tightened around them. Sarah's pulse raced, and she struggled to break free from the growing web, but it was futile. The land was alive, and it was pulling them in, binding them to its dark will. It was too late. They had been part of the forest for too long, and as the mist swallowed them whole, they understood. They weren't just trapped in the sanctuary, they were becoming a part of it, forever. The forest, the sanctuary, the The sparrows it all existed in a delicate balance, a cycle of life and death that could never be broken. The caretakers had fed the land, had nurtured it, and now it was time for them to join its eternal, shadowed embrace. And as the mist closed in around them, the call of the sparrows, their wings fluttering faintly in the distance, was the only sound left.